Welcome back to Mao's Domestic Policies, Part 3, in which we're going to be looking at the Great Leap Forward. That is a real tongue twister, y'all. Try saying it real fast 3 times. Great leap forward, great leap forward. Yeah. On agriculture. So we're going to be looking at the Great Leap Forward in agriculture, and keep in mind the learning outcomes, looking at, analyzing these policies according to ideology and practicality, maintenance of power, and what was the policy and the impacts. Understand what was going on. Alrighty, here we go. So here we're going to start looking at the Great Leap Forward, which begins in 1958, and collectivization. This is a little out of order, or hey, you can watch the videos in any order you want, because the next one is going to actually look at the Great Leap Forward and industrialization. Now, and the move towards that. However, here we're going to look at Great Leap Forward and agriculture. And the Great Leap Forward was this comprehensive program that was going to address both agriculture and industry, basically the entire economy, like in all integrated in one fell swoop. This is a little different than what other single party leaders have done in terms of having agricultural policies, bam, and then having industrial policies. And collectivization is an important aspect of this Great Leap Forward.
With the help of Soviet advisors, Mao's government began dozens of huge industrial projects. This development and Soviet help had to be paid for. Mao looked to China's peasants to foot the bill. But traditional family farms could not produce enough to pay for industry. In 1953, the Communists began to socialize agriculture. First, they encouraged families to pool their property in small farms called cooperatives.
When you explained clearly to people what it meant to till the land together, with people working together, we would have more manpower and we would be able to increase production and our life would become better. When people accepted this, a few families started working together.
After the cooperative was set up, our life was much better. We could afford to raise pigs. Before, we didn't have enough grain to raise them. When the pigs grew, I sold them and got more cash. I also sold vegetable seeds in the town market. We had more land, enough labor, plus some sidelines, so our income increased.
As the previous video clip has shown you, I know it seems a little out of order, but things. Collectivization is actually going to be a response to the previous clip. And if you remember the chart that we saw earlier in land reform, you can see the timeline of when this is happening. The cooperatives were massively successful. And people were making money, people were happy. The lives of the average Chinese person had had improved dramatically. But, for Mao, the cooperatives did not align with the ideology. People are moving away from communism and backsliding into capitalism. So our goal in terms of agriculture and the Industrial Revolution I'm sorry. Actually, it was supposed to be an industrial revolution for China. And this great leap forward is to increase production. Again, you have a really large population that has not had enough food. And the other thing is food, agricultural goods, is essentially the only thing that Mao has now that can be used to make money. And that money is going to be important when we talk about the industry a little bit later. Collectivization was to end private farming and putting people into massive communes. It also is supposed to provide a vertical integration of people. Vertical integration is essentially when you have like one industry and all aspects of that one industry lockstep into each other. And so the things at the bottom, right, the industry, the aspect at the bottom produces the goods that is going to be needed for the level above, and so on and so forth. So these communes were supposed to manage everything. So it was supposed to be the integration of all aspects of community life into this sort of organized collective. And so the communes were supposed to manage cooperative projects for electricity production, irrigation, road building, factories, flood control. So instead of having government ministries where you have a transport authority that does all of this from the federal or the national level to the local, instead you have the commune, which organizes all aspects of life for this. So from something as tech specific as electricity production, actually everything was kind of tech specific. And they're supposed to be making food as well, or growing food as well, right? And consider in what ways this sort of aligns with Mao's ideology. There were something like 70,000 communes, and they went up to like thousands of people each. Obviously, if you have a population of 500, 600 million down to 70,000 communes, these were massive.
Mao decided to visit some villages to see what was going on. I went with him. Once we came to a village and saw a banner with these words on it. People's communes are good. He read the words. People's communes are good. A reporter happened to be next to Mao and took down his words. The next day, the words appeared in the newspapers. That's how people's communes started.
Mao's word was so powerful that almost overnight, people's communes sprang up across China. A commune encompassed many villages with thousands of families. Each day was strictly regimented, and family life was virtually abolished. Children were placed in communal nurseries while their parents worked around the clock. People ate in the fields or in communal dining halls.
Mao's explanation of the communes is as follows. The people have taken to organizing themselves along military lines, working with militancy and leading a collective life. And this has raised the political consciousness of the 500 million peasants still further. Community dining rooms, kindergartens, nurseries, sewing groups, barbershops, public baths, happy homes for the aged, agricultural middle schools, red and expert schools are leading the peasants toward a happier collective life and further fostering the ideas of collectivism among the peasant masses. But I think we can go a little further in our exploration than what Mao's physician said and what Mao said about this collectivization. Again, there were 70,000 communes, and yes, they were organized along military lines with, that 70,000 was divided into 750 brigades, and the brigades would then have about 200 households per brigade. Keep in mind that households at this time were multi-generational. So you can have many people comprising of a single household. And again, this kind of points to that sort of vertical integration of society. All right. Now, the thing is Mao said that this was voluntary on the part of the peasants. The peasants resisted collectivization. They were doing very well in the cooperative system. People were being fed, they were making money, they saw their lives had improved. When you get to government collectivization, this means that everything is entirely under the control of the central government. The government controls the seeds. The government controls the machinery. The government decides on the farming methods. The government decides on actually what you farm. The government decides on the sale and distribution of what you produce. And the government also sets the prices. So the improvements that the peasants had been enjoying are not going to exist under this system, because it's all centralized from Beijing and sent down to the regional managers that are sent down to the provincial managers, sent down to the commune heads, etc., etc. And internal passports are needed to travel between the communes. So this is actually going to control people's lives more. And there is no private farming. So people might have some tiny little plots to say grow an additional something else only for personal consumption, but for extra selling or anything like that, not going to exist. John King Fairbank, our liberal Orthodox historian, states that the revolutionary states having established its legitimacy by freeing the peasant from landlordism, now had him boxed in as never before. The state had become the ultimate landlord.
Cooperatives grew at an astonishing speed. By the end of 1955, almost 2/3 of the peasants had joined. This was much faster than Mao had ever hoped. Seizing the momentum, he ordered the country to move to the next stage of socialism, to collectivization. But for most peasants, this was going too far. In collectives, private property was abolished. People had to give up their animals, their tools, and their land. Party officials put intense pressure on families to join.
By then, people were unhappy. They weren't comfortable forming a collective with the whole village. Some villagers didn't get on with others. My father was quite well off, so he didn't want to join either. I was a party official in the village. I told him if I weren't an official, I wouldn't insist he join. If you didn't join, you wouldn't look good in front of your neighbors. With my persuasion and the example of others, he gave in. But he joined with reluctance. His income was quite high. It went down after he joined, so he was unhappy.
Within months, all of China's 600 million peasants were working in huge collectives. For the first time in history, the farm output of the entire nation was under government control. The government decided how much grain the peasants could keep. The rest had to be sold at low prices to the state.
The grain ration for the peasants was very low, not enough. Plus, you had to obey the leadership. You had to fulfill the state quota. State first, then the people.
Peasants complained about the policies.
They said, we can't keep one extra ear of grain for ourselves. Do you think this is fair? I said, it's not fair. So I wrote to the provincial leadership. Things couldn't go on like this. No matter how much you grew, you still had to give it to the state. You couldn't eat it. The province sent people down to investigate. They saw things were just the way I said, but they couldn't solve it. It was a big problem.
Collectives did not make the peasants better off, nor did they increase production. Mao still had to find a way to finance his vision of an industrial China.
Which brings us to ask, and you to answer the question, why collectivization? Now, you have been doing so many things looking at this collectivization. So now it is time for you to answer the red questions. Right. So consider what is going to fuel this desire and need for collectivization. Think about ideology in answering this question, and think about, maintenance of power. Go back and examine Fairbank's quote. What does he mean by all of that? The other thing really, that the reason why you want to do this, and I know you really want to, is you will likely remember the paraphrase, your explanation of Fairbank's quote, rather than the quote itself. Also, by explaining the quote, that means that you will better be able to use it in historiography meaningfully. So right now, you should pause and answer the questions. And I'm sure you paused because I live in a world where my students are awesome and my students do everything that I ask them to do. It's a wonderful, wonderful world. But we still have to answer other aspects of why collectivization is the means that Mao is going to use. So we're going to focus now, instead of just the ideology of the previous red questions, we're going to look at a little bit more real world. And one of the things to consider is Mao's attitude toward the peasants. Now, one would think Mao himself was a peasant, wealthier than some, but still a peasant. And as such, he knew what their lives were like. He could sympathize with them. He knew how to talk to them, and he understood them. Now, this allows him to be a great peasant leader during the Civil War. However, once the state is established, it's going to be a whole lot of different. Because Mao thought that peasants were inherently capitalistic. This is his quote. And the reason why, and when we talk about inherently capitalistic, we're saying that they are greedy, and they are selfish. So these are not a group of people who work toward the common good. And as such, in order to bring about good for the common, it means that the state is going to have to be involved. And in 1959, during the midst of this great leap forward, and when things start turning sour, Mao says that peasants are hiding food and are very bad. There is no communist spirit in them. Peasants are, after all, peasants. That's the only way they can behave. So think about that in terms of the relationship between the state and the people. The second major practical reason that we want to look at why collectivization was chosen is because we have this big push for industrialization. Hint, hint, contrast to Stalin's desire for collectivization. So we need to provide a basis for industrialization. And that is going to happen in two ways in terms of support for the workers. Now, or three ways, me, numbers, Now, by the time we get to this point where they start to enforce collectivization, the farming cooperatives had been going on for a few years, and real gains had been made in terms of amount being produced. But they weren't seeing the government wasn't seeing those gains. The peasants' lives were becoming better. And so the government is going to need to seize control of the means of agricultural production in order that they're able to see the gains, right? Peasants are getting wealthier, but not the government. The other thing that's happening at this time, by the time we get to collectivization, the first 5-year plan is well underway. And targets had been established for this first 5-year plan. Ambitious targets. Urbanization had increased, so you had more people moving to the city to work in these factories. However, it wasn't enough. They were not going to meet the targets. And so in order for those targets to be met, more people, many more people had to move to the cities to work. When you take people from the countryside and move them to the cities, you need to be able to provide food for them because now they are no longer providing food for themselves. So the government needs to be able to redirect where the food is going so that they can have people in the cities working in industry. And the other way that is going to be used to support industry is to generate income. China is an agricultural country. China's only means of generating money at this point in time and foreign income, because you need hard currencies to be able to buy the stuff that you need to drive all of this. And this is their only way of actually generating money. So the government needs to control this in order to generate the money that they need to invest in industrialization. Industrialization was fueled by a large amount of loan money from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was like, China, there is no such thing as a free lunch. So China needs to be able to make payments on those loans, and she needs money to do so.
While the government called on everyone to make steel, they also wanted to increase farm output.
How could we increase the grain harvest? People said that if you did close planting and used more fertilizer, you would definitely increase output. People got carried away. They were hot-headed. From Mao Zedong and the Central Party Committee down to leaders at all levels, everyone was full of enthusiasm.
During the Great Leap Forward, we believed miracles could happen. There was a saying, the corn will grow higher the more you desire. Communes and schools reported their wonderful news to the party. If one commune said they could turn out 150 tons an acre, another one would say their target was 180 tons. Each commune or school would promise a higher amount until the last school gave their highest figure. Our school set the target of 470 tons an acre. We dug a hole, something like a swimming pool. We thought if we put all the fertilizer in it, we would achieve our target. Then we poured the seeds in, which built up into a layer about this thick. There was a photograph in the People's Daily that showed the wheat in a field supporting the weight of children.
Some leaders of the Central Party Committee were so happy that they put this photo on their desks at work. Most people believed it.
We were surprised to see that photo and wondered how it could be possible. But because we were city people, we couldn't be sure it was a fake.
When I went with Mao to the villages, I really did see so much grain in the fields, so much rice. The yields were so high. At the time, I thought everything was true.
After the anti-rightist campaign, few dared to ask questions.
Only one teacher spoke out. How thick would the wheat be if we did produce 470 tons? Immediately, he was accused of being a rightist and not believing in the party.
Later, I learned it was all fake. The peasants were putting on a show for us. They moved grain from other places and put it all in one field. It was all a show for Mao.
Under pressure to produce more, to launch satellites to heaven, as it was called, party officials inflated production figures. An ominous cycle began as the state took more and more grain based on false figures, leaving the peasants with nothing to eat.
For example, the output was 5 tons of grain, but 10 tons were reported. Then the state would collect grain based on 10 tons.
Our commune committee calculated that our yield was 1,800 pounds an acre. It didn't qualify us to go up to heaven. But the deputy had an idea. He added the melons, fruits, pears, peaches, turnips, and vegetables to the grain, counting them as grain output. So the yield became 2,600 pounds per acre. Now we were qualified to go up to heaven. The commune committee did not want to calculate this way. It was cheating. But those people were higher up. What could we do? I have this problem. I get emotional very easily. I wondered why, the higher the official, the more he dared to lie, to deceive the party and the people. Jiang Hongbin, the financial secretary, was horrified when he heard such an enormous figure. He said, "Are you letting people eat? This is sheer absurdity."
Party officials ignored the protests and continued to submit the inflated figures. The state took the grain accordingly. It was sent to feed the cities, repay Soviet debts, or left to rot in warehouses. Peasants across China were beginning to starve.
Anhui was one of the 4 provinces worst hit. All my mother could do was gather weeds with my aunt. There wasn't enough grain, so we ate weeds.
By the summer of 1959, the leaders knew the Great Leap Forward was going badly wrong.
Mao decided to go back to Shaoshan, his hometown, to have a look. He wanted to find out the truth. He wanted people to speak freely. I think that when he was in Shaoshan, he found that there really were problems in the Great Leap Forward.
Which brings us to look at the results of this collectivization. There was a huge amount of propaganda. people had to be convinced to do this. Um, People were doing well under the cooperative. So there was a huge amount of sort of molding people to follow the lines of the government. There was also quite a lot of sort of pressure and physical force as well. Ultimately, this Great Leap Forward agricultural policy was a failure. China had been subsistence farmers, and they did not have the knowledge of large scale farming necessary for this. They didn't have knowledge of the techniques to use, fertilizer, etc., etc. So it was a massive shift from the way people operated before, and not enough education. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we look at the section of the Great Famine. Because the farming production was happening from Beijing, or the decision on what to produce was happening from Beijing, you have the suppression of important foods. So things that might be nutritionally important, the things that might grow well in that area. Consider what happened with Mussolini, right? And ultimately, you're going to have this great famine of 25 to 40 million dead. We'll look at that in greater detail a little bit later. We're going to take a bit of time and evaluate this, but keep in mind that some of this will make a bit more sense once we look at the industrial aspect. And also that the Great Leap Forward was a holistic endeavor. So it's a little bit difficult to separate the evaluations. It's just easier to present it separately, agriculture and industry. But again, remember that these were sort of symbiotic. They were supposed to be interlocking to produce the ultimate goal. One of the reasons for the results, such as this Great Famine, is that the government ignored local conditions and variety. Keep in mind, China is massive. China has every kind of landscape that one can imagine, and the people making the decisions are not from these local areas. They live up in Beijing. All right. So the items that they're telling people to plant may not have done well in that kind of soil. And it was a monolithic decision on what to plant rather than the variety or the range of things that people were used to eating and used to growing. And of course, farmers are being directed away from food production. And this is part of the industrial aspect of the Great Leap Forward. So farmers are not producing food, and therefore you have lower amounts of food produced. You're also going to have the varieties in local conditions like floods and drought and things like this. So if you have people in areas that can produce not producing, then there's going to be a problem once you have something a local one particular area has drought. Okay, but there was an increase in grain production, and we will stop here because next we're going to be looking at the industrial part, and as we do that, keep all of this in mind.